as we look at example 10, one of the things you want to notice is that we have multiple logarithms. And so we see a logarithm of x and a logarithm of x plus 3, specifically natural logs. And because we have multiple logarithms on one side, we're going to need to condense them. So when it talks about isolating the logarithms, in order to isolate it, part of what we need is to only have a singular logarithm. So we need to take these two and condense them. Since they're currently being added as two logarithms, our condensing technique involves multiplying them together. So the rules for condensing haven't changed. What we can do is we can also then go ahead and distribute that x, so x squared plus 3x equals 1. Now, one thing we might want to notice is that in order to do our rewrite stage, just like we saw earlier, we might feel better writing the base e in, so that when we go to rewrite it, it's e to the first equals x squared plus 3x. Now, an important thing to understand about this problem is we've done all the pre-calc at this time. Everything else we do from this point forward is all about solving the equation. And solving for this is honestly an Algebra 1 skill. So what I notice is that I have an x squared, which makes me recognize it's a quadratic. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is probably put everything on one side. So I'm going to have x squared plus 3x minus e, because if the e is positive on the left, it needs to be negative on the right, so that it equals 0. And as a quadratic equation, I don't feel like I can factor that, so I'm going to use the quadratic formula in order to solve it. So I'm going to do that work over here off to the side, starting first with my formula, x equals opposite of b, so RB is 3, opposite of 3 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 3 squared, minus 4 times 1 times negative e. The negative e in there. I'll make it with a different color so it's a little bit easier to read since I'm in a pen. And then we need to still divide by 2 times our a value. Our a value is 1. So we're going to clean that up a little bit and see what we get. Negative 3 plus or minus. We end up with 9 plus 4e, all divided by 2. Now, when we're looking at this, we cannot take the square root of each of these elements independently. This is the square root of the entire sum. And so we're not able to simplify this much further. What we do want to recognize, though, is that we have two answers right now. We have the opposite of 3 plus the 9 plus 4e all over 2, and we have the x equals the negative 3 minus. So we have both of the square roots that we need to represent in terms of our answer potential options. What's going to happen, though, is I'm going to need to evaluate these with a calculator. I'm going to encourage you to type that in and test your ability. Okay. Keep in mind that we need to use a correct number of parentheses, or we need to use the fraction option as need be in order to get this properly divided by 2. We're going to use the e, which is above the divide key if you want, since we don't need a power. And so our value turns out to be 0.729 for our positive situation and our approximation. So I think taking the log of a positive is good, so I can just assume that both of these answers are content. So again, our first one was exact, and the 0.729 is our approximate. When I go to test this, though, just changing the plus to a minus, then I notice that my approximation value, according to the calculator, is negative 3.729. And so what I want to recognize is that if I were to take that negative 3.7 and try and take the log of it, or take the log of negative 3.7 plus 3, both of these, are logs of negatives, and we can't take the log of a negative, so instead we have to recognize that this is an extraneous solution and it gets thrown out, both in the exact version and the approximate, because they both have the same value. So we're left with really just one exact answer and its approximation.